Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we are going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons associated stock price. The stock price that is associated with Dungeons & Dragons. And I'll define that actual term a little bit more when we get closer to its applicability. But Dungeons & Dragons has an associated stock price, and we're going to talk about it through the entirety of Dungeons & Dragons' 45-year history, from 1974, the genesis of Dungeons & Dragons, all the way up to today, 2019, which is close to the 5-year anniversary of 5th edition. So let's talk about it. All right, let's jump right in. All right, so original edition. Original edition ran from 1974 to 1977. Original edition was owned by TSR. Original edition had no D&D, Dungeons & Dragons associated stock price. The reason why is TSR was never publicly traded. From all the research that I've done, TSR that owned Dungeons & Dragons from 1974 to 1997, that company was never publicly traded. Okay, so there was no associated stock price. So Dungeons & Dragons original edition, 1974 to 1977, no D&D associated stock price. First edition ran from 1977 all the way to 1989. First edition also, because it was because Dungeons & Dragons at the time was owned by was specifically owned by TSR, had no D&D associated stock price. All right. 1989, we move into second edition of the game, and again, second edition of Dungeons & Dragons had no D&D associated stock price because it was owned by TSR. All right, 1997, TSR is in financial crisis. They owed $30 million to bookstores that were trying to return their product because they couldn't sell it, right? So TSR had created a glut of product, and they had this ability for large chains to buy their books, and then they had a policy where they could return those books, and D&D was in, they were upside down. Like, they were in $30 million in debt for the product they had printed, right? So they were in financial crisis. Well, 1997, Wizards of the Coast waltz in and buys TSR lock, stock, and barrel, and now Wizards of the Coast is the owner of Dungeons & Dragons. Wizards of the Coast was able to pay, significantly for Dungeons & Dragons, and buy it lock, stock, and barrel, buy TSR for lock, stock, and barrel, because they're flush with cash from Magic the Gathering. All right. Wizards of the Coast, again, to my research, everything that I could find, they have never been publicly traded, right? So between 1997, the little blip of time between 1997 and 1999, when Wizards of the Coast owned TSR and Dungeons & Dragons, second edition remained having no D&D associated stock price. All right. In 1999, Hasbro buys Wizards of the Coast. Hasbro is now the owner of Wizards of the Coast, and more importantly, the Hasbro now becomes the owner of Dungeons & Dragons, right? One of the first thing Hasbro does is it creates third edition. In the year 2000, the PHB for Dungeons & Dragons, the core rulebooks, come out, and in the year 2000, for the first time, under third edition, under Hasbro, Dungeons & Dragons gets a D&D associated stock price. Now let's talk about that. What is a Dungeons & Dragons associated stock price? Well, it is Hasbro's stock price, because at this point, Hasbro is the owner of Dungeons & Dragons. Now at this point, the stock price of Hasbro is not wholly related to Dungeons & Dragons, right? But it is not wholly unrelated to Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is now part of the portfolio of intellectual properties that Hasbro owns, right? So literally in its financial reports, starting within 2000, Dungeons & Dragons is a financial concern for investors and analysts. This is a big change, and it's a really important change, right? It's really significant, right? So at this point, in the year 2000, with the release of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition. This is the first edition of the Dungeons & Dragons game that has a Dungeons & Dragons associated stock price. So now Dungeons & Dragons is associated with a stock price. It's not a 100% lock, but it's not 100% unrelated at all. Actually, in fact, it is really quite related, right? All right, so let's dive into it, okay? In the year 2000, the Dungeons & Dragons associated stock price, Hasbro stock price, is $10 per share, okay? So now we're going to jump forward to the year 2008, 8 years later. 4th edition comes out. Now, what happens with 4th edition? 4th edition comes out in 2008, and at the time when 4th edition, the core rulebooks are released, when the newer edition is released, the stock price for Hasbro, the D&D associated stock price, is $36. That is an increase in value from 3E to 4E of 260%, right? So the D&D associated stock price has now risen 260% between 3E publishing and 4E publishing. All right. Now we're at 4E publishing. What happens between 4E publishing and the publishing of 5E? All right. So we jump forward to year 2014. In 2014, okay, 5th edition releases. At the time of 5th edition's release, the stock price value for Hasbro is $51. $51. This is a 41% increase over the 41% increase for the Dungeons & Dragons associated stock price. Okay, 41% increase between 4th edition and then 5th edition. All right, now we just reached the 5-year anniversary about a month ago. We reached the 5-year anniversary for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Between the release of the core rulebooks for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in 2014 and the 5-year anniversary for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in the year 2019, the stock price goes from $51 and it leaps all the way to $115. That is the current value of Hasbro stock. That is the current Dungeons & Dragons associated stock price, okay? That is an increase in 5 years of performance. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition helped to increase the Hasbro stock price 125%, all right? So we'll tick it off. From a purely a performance perspective, right? And in how Dungeons & Dragons helped to raise Hasbro's stock price, 3rd edition was by far the most successful. 4th edition was by far the least successful. And specifically, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has performed very, very well. So that is the history of the Dungeons & Dragons associated stock price, right? So original edition, 1st edition, 2nd edition, no associated Dungeons & Dragons stock price because TSR and Wizards of the Coast were not publicly traded. And then for Dungeons & Dragons under Hasbro, it starts with 3rd edition at $10. In 4th edition, it raises to $36. With 5th edition, it raises to $51. And after 5 years of 5th edition on the market, the stock price is at $115, right? Now, what are some of the things we can learn from this, right? Well, I think we can make some suppositions based on these numbers. So one thing is that, again, I'll reiterate, Dungeons & Dragons is absolutely not the only reason why Hasbro has succeeded as well as it has. It's had a very, very good arc with its stock price. However, Dungeons & Dragons is absolutely part of the engine that drives Hasbro, without a doubt. One of the other things is, it is my opinion that one of the reasons that Dungeons & Dragons has been extremely helpful to Hasbro's stock price based on the movie. The movie of the year 2000 definitely did not help anybody. No one was happy with the 2000 Dungeons & Dragons movie, okay? Not Hasbro, not the fans, not the investors, not Hollywood, not any of the actors who created. Nobody was made happy by the Dungeons & Dragons 2000 movie, okay? But that was there, and really the reality is Dungeons & Dragons was performing on its own and was continuing to move the ball forward. But even as soon as 5 years after that debacle that was the 2000 Dungeons & Dragons movie, there was talk again of, what if we executed well, right? And now we are in the MCU era, right? So the Marvel Cinematic Universe has said, if you build a cinematic universe and you execute well on that cinematic universe, you can make billions, especially with an element of Americana, which is exactly what Marvel Comics are, and it's exactly what Dungeons & Dragons is. They both have an American genesis. They are both part of American there are both elements of Americana. So the reality is, right now, it is my opinion that Dungeons & Dragons is continuing to help keep the Hasbro stock price strong, because there is always the possibility right now. There remains the possibility of a solid, good execution on the Dungeons & Dragons movie, which could launch a massive 10 or 20-year run of multi-billion-dollar films, right? That is what the MCU has taught Hollywood. That is what the MCU has taught investors. That is what the MCU has taught intellectual property holding companies, right? So that is the real ball of wax. And I will tell you right now, the little rounding error profits that Dungeons & Dragons makes each year, which we know for a fact is below $50 million, and for a large multinational corporation like Hasbro, it's really a blip. You know, we know, we don't really know how much money Dungeons & Dragons makes, but we know it's less than $50 million. And the reason why for that is 2 years ago, ICV2 said that the entire industry of tabletop role-playing games is less than $35 million, right? So we know Dungeons & Dragons makes less than $50 million a year, okay? So with that, now that's an extrapolation, and that's, you know, again, my extrapolation. But the reality is, but Hasbro, I think, is very excited to continue to own the Dungeons & Dragons brand, and really has no interest in selling the Dungeons & Dragons brand because of this possibility of 1 to 2 decades of multi-billion-dollar films. And if there is good execution on the Dungeons & Dragons movie, that is what Dungeons & Dragons' real value can be, right? The print books are nice, they make money, it's good to have that, but the reality is the value in Dungeons & Dragons really has nothing to do, in my opinion, with the print books. It has to do with an incredibly lucrative, creative, intelligent, artistic list of buyers. That data is incredibly valuable, right? In addition to that, it has to do with owning an element of Americana, right? Merch. The merch for Dungeons & Dragons can be quite valuable. Now, I'm not talking the cool rule books. I'm just talking like T-shirts and sneakers and all that, right? That has value. And then the last is this looming potential, massive potential for the Dungeons & Dragons movie series. It's a big deal. It's very, very significant, and I think it's really quite significant. And I think when we look at the Dungeons & Dragons Associated stock price, it shows us, hey, it says, hey, this is what it's going to take to make this work, right? And so that's what we have. That's where we land for you know, having looked at the entire history of Dungeons & Dragons, of the Dungeons & Dragons Associated stock price, which is Hasbro's stock price. So thank you very much for exploring this this grouping of data with me today. Very much appreciate it. I'd love to know what role do you think Dungeons & Dragons plays in keeping the stock price for Hasbro strong? Also, what do you think are the possibilities of the Dungeons & Dragons series in 3 to 5 to 7 years actually spawning an MCU level massive success in the film area? I'm really curious. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.